All right, here we go. We're live. So, hello everyone, and welcome to episode number 6 of DESMA Chats. My name is Andrew Whitcomb, and I'm part of the DESMA network, and I've been kind of helping host these chats with different people working in design management, either research and practice from all over the world. And today we're really excited to be joined by Kipum Lee, who's joining us from Pittsburgh, I believe. And we're going to talk a little bit about beauty in organizations, which I think is a pretty interesting topic. So I think rather than me trying to introduce you, Kip, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what you're doing, and then we'll get this chat going.
Sure. I am, goodness. I have, well, I'll start with my education, I guess, because that's a good place to start sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I have an undergrad degree in bioengineering, and what's interesting is never thought I'd be a bioengineer, but anyways, I did a little bit of architecture grad school at one time as well, but then eventually found my way into to go into Carnegie Mellon, the design program almost 10 years ago now, and where I got a master's in interaction design, and I kind of stumbled upon it. At the time, I had no idea what interaction design was, but I was applying to 3 or 4 grad programs. The other programs were for industrial design, but then the only reason why I went to Carnegie Mellon at the time was because my wife-to-be at the time, who lived in Baltimore, Pittsburgh just happened to be the closest program that I'd gotten into. So I thought it was industrial design, but then when I got into the program, I think the first week of grad school, we were hosting at CMU at the time the second service design conference.
Okay.
And so here I was. I thought we were going to, do industrial design stuff, and was completely blown away participating in the service design conference, which was led by Shelley Evanson at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the grad students there. No, I take that back. That was the first ever service design conference in the United States. And then the following year, I got to participate and help out with the second one. But yeah, can you imagine this guy who came to, grad school thinking he was going to be doing industrial design? And, actually part of the reason why I went into bioengineering was because I thought I would be designing prosthetics and combining maybe industrial design with helping people, merge that with healthcare.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that. But then I was thinking, finally I get to, it was industrial design that I wanted to do all along. And then I get to Carnegie Mellon, and poof, just blown away by service design. And, even if we were to reduce it in very simple terms, although it's a lot more complicated than that, but just thinking, wow, it's possible to design or design for intangibles. That was enough to get me excited and thinking, wow, this is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And then I met my current PhD advisor, who was also the head of design at the design program at the time, or at least in charge of the PhD doctoral students, Professor Richard Buchanan. Mm-hmm. And his class on interaction design, the introduction to interaction design, that blew me away as well. So I think in some ways I was, as Immanuel Kant, I think once said, when he read David Hume, he awoke from his dogmatic slumber. I think, because in college and, architecture grad school, I thought, this is so dry, and I guess this is what you have to do to grow up. And I loved learning in high school, but then it was during my time at Carnegie Mellon where I felt like I came alive again. And ever since then, I've been so interested in design. And what I really appreciated was it was so much more than what I thought design to be, as this world of artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I guess some of the research that I'm doing with beauty is really to challenge some of that thinking about beauty. Although designers have moved well beyond thinking about products, especially, as something that transcends and goes beyond just the things that we build, the artifactual, tangible things that we make. But surprisingly, if you comb through the management literature, where you see little pieces of or evidences or instances of beauty, which a lot of the management scholars call aesthetic experience, or the aesthetic knowledge in human systems or organizations. A lot of it, interestingly, reduces down to things and artifacts. They talk a lot about corporate structures, the buildings that companies make to represent their ideals and their culture. The layout, should we have an open, office layout versus cubes and enclosed offices? Because those structures, quite literal structures, oftentimes have a way of imposing specific scripts and codes as far as who is more powerful than others. Or it's interesting how these the environments or the surroundings that we do work in have a tendency to affect our behaviors and attitudes.
Sure.
But it's interesting. A lot of it still boils down to the things in our surrounding. And I guess in some ways, if design has already had that that expansion of thinking about products beyond just things and symbols and signs, in some ways management is right at that point where I think it's begging for some research and for folks to come in and say, if you really want to apply design thinking, I mean, even look at the new Harvard Business Review special issue, September last month, where I think the subtitle of the special issue was, after the title of the evolution of design thinking, going from products to everything else within the company. So in some ways, that metaphorical artifact, we talk about organizational artifacts, even that language, I think, betrays that tendency to think about management and organizations as things. Yeah. So anyways, I'll stop talking now.
No, that's great. I mean, it's a really deep topic, especially when you get into questions of beauty and then also tangibility and kind of intangibility. Yeah. And I think one of the conversations we've had within the DESMA group is kind of different notions of aesthetics. And some people are really going back to just saying, well, what is the definition of aesthetics? And literally being of the senses, and saying that the body is really important in judging beauty, or potentially and kind of how you interact with the physical world and artifacts, being something that's very important to the way that people organize and the way that services run and kind of the way that people experience them. But that oftentimes when people talk about aesthetics, they might kind of forget the senses. It might be seeing, well, not seeing, that's a sense, but suggesting that something can be beautiful kind of outside of an experience of it, of a physical experience through the senses, and that beauty is somehow removed from the personal. So do you see organizations and kind of management research starting to embrace some of that kind of, you need to kind of understand things through your bodies, the way that kind of designers are working? And is that somewhere that you think kind of management could be going as a direction in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question and point. I think, and I'm still formulating my own thoughts. Yeah. And as we were talking before we went officially live, just a lot of this is I think I'm personally experimenting with some of these ideas. So I guess we'll just make ourselves vulnerable today. But there's a lot of I think design has a lot to offer, especially when we think about the embodiment of values, of codes, of different information and communication. I mean, it ranges from the actual things like chairs and furniture, the stuff within space, to also even human beings as embodiments of culture. It's interesting, even across some of the literature, using the human body as little representations of the values of an organization. So how people dress, the uniforms that they wear, the stuff that people say, and how they, you know, how they perform, their gestures.
Sure.
Yeah, there's certainly I think design offers that shift from a lot of the management research. I think has been, even in the cultural sphere, has been very cognitive and intellectual. We talk about things like cognitive dissonance, distributed cognition, and I think a lot of the aesthetic researchers in Europe primarily made a huge contribution. I think the late 70s or 80s, saying, you know what, you have people like Edgar Sheen talking about the 3 different levels of culture, and at the way bottom, the deep, you know, the real stuff is the values and beliefs, and at the top is the surface stuff, the things that you see, which are in a sense expressions of the deeper real stuff. I don't know if he necessarily meant it that way, but I think it's been interpreted that way. And a lot of the folks in Europe and continental researchers said, you know what, why do we, you know, if artifacts and the things we see are really the vehicles and carriers of culture, why is it that it's never really discussed? It's the stuff that's right in front of us, the things that are taken for granted, and we don't really talk about those things. And I think they've made a huge contribution to one aspect of beauty and aesthetics. And even, you know, places like IDEO and some of the, you know, companies in the United States, where instead of brainstorming, they introduced the idea of body storming. Where, you know, and then you have chapters, I think even our very own Professor Fred Colopy in Managing and Design as Designing book, where he has a chapter on, I Think with My Hands, inspired by Maya Lin and The Architect. And so, you know, challenging and questioning that, in some ways, arbitrary separation between mind and body. That's something I think that design can certainly participate in. But I think at this point, that literature, I think, is very saturated. There's some good stuff that's come out already. But then I want to really enlarge this idea of beauty, because if you go beyond the 1700s, where aesthetics really became a formal discipline, in some ways a legitimate discipline within philosophy, beauty has always been around. And even if we start with the Greeks, they had a very different notion of beauty. I would say a more enlarged idea of beauty that incorporates the senses, especially the sense of the sight and the ears, but also things like order and proportion and harmony, and symmetry. You read someone like Vitruvius, where he talks about proportion and harmony, and it might express itself at the end in concrete physical ways, but it's really that search for a deeper order of the cosmos and the universe. And of course, there's also a transcendent way, where you look at Plato and his idea. I mean, he talks about the circle, the perfect circle, that you won't ever find in this world of appearances, but we know what a circle is. And so this idea of, oftentimes it connects with numbers and geometry, and it's more of an abstract world of ideas in some of the ways people have thought about beauty. And there's also another way of thinking about beauty as fit and suitability, where it's not just about the stuff in the museums that's beautiful, but anything, whether it's a process or a thing or even a system, if it's supposed to be doing what it's meant to do, that's another form of beauty. So even a garbage can, if it's supposed to function as what a garbage can is supposed to do, you can say that that's also beautiful. So there is a world, I think, a way of thinking about beauty beyond the senses. In fact, one of the most powerful, if we had to simplify beauty in one spectrum or one dimension, there's at one end, thinking about beauty as desire appealing to the senses. And at the other end, people have talked about beauty throughout history as something that's more contemplative in the mind. So how do you reconcile all that?
Yeah.
It's one of those concepts where there's a huge semantic field of variance.
Yeah.
And I guess another way of thinking about it is it's a rich idea, a rich concept, and we shouldn't be content with thinking about it just in terms of the senses,
Sure.
just in the way we, aesthetics, like you said, it ties back to the root word is, sense. But, there's something more to beauty than just the physical senses. And Plato would certainly, I think, say that as well.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
As I was kind of thinking about this topic, beauty in organizations, I was thinking of different ways people have kind of discussed organizations, and thinking of organizations as kind of an ongoing process, kind of an action. People are always organizing it.
Right.
And then I was thinking, okay, but a lot of discussions of beauty are focused on kind of things that you can kind of put in place or kind of static, or you can kind of look at and see it. And then so I was trying to think of other examples. Okay, well, what else is beautiful that's an action? And
right.
Jazz came to mind, jazz music. And when I first, growing up, I wasn't exposed to a lot of jazz. So then when I first kind of encountered jazz and people were playing it for me, and it sounds a little bit discordant at first, and I wasn't really sure what was going on, or why anybody really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, okay, well, maybe that's a good kind of comparison to organizations, that the things that are happening in organizations are the actions that people are taking. They might seem foreign, or they might be unfamiliar at first, or maybe not even seem beautiful, but then how over time you might actually kind of adjust to it and kind of see the beauty in it. Is kind of, I don't know, that was kind of an interesting reflection I had. I don't know if that,
no, I think that's great. How American of you. How American of us, talk about jazz. I think you're touching upon a really interesting and important point here, and that is what I've discovered combing through the literature. While as there is a tendency to think about beauty in terms of the static things and artifacts in our work environments, there's an emphasis on space. It's a lot about, even if you think about the human body, embodiment, even if you think about the human being, and not just the physical structures of things within an organization, you're still talking about space. And I think that's why architecture, out of all the design disciplines, has been really closely aligned with some of the aesthetic research.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's even a really interesting piece by Professor Mauro, I don't know how to pronounce his name, I think it's Julian. Okay. He's a professor at Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's actually made the argument that even scientific management, as cold and sterile as it is, there's actually a type of beauty or aesthetic dimension to it. And he's got a really interesting article and book that he came out with, especially, again, tying it to Europe, where in Europe, they really thought Henry Ford and Frederick Taylor were like demigods. They weren't, they were big in the United States, but in Europe, they were like, oh my gosh, these guys, the scientific management thing, they took that principle and applied it to their architecture. So if you could probably go outside and see this all around you in Europe. You take someone like Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. Modernism, in a sense, is a way of taking the principles of scientific management and applying it to the physical surrounding and environment, to the buildings and spaces. So even in that, there's this idea of space that keeps on, that I keep on seeing. But you bring up actions. You talk about jazz. I think you're bringing in this notion of time that I haven't really seen too much in the literature. And in fact, I'm interested in the idea of organizations emphasizing and focusing their energy into what we would call experiences. Client experience, customer experience, patient experience, guest experience, user experience. this is one of the big themes right now that is really bringing design and management thinking closer together. Service design, even. Once you start talking about how organizations need to improve their services, well, holy smokes, you're talking about how different functions and divisions within the organization that are probably siloed with their own unique, insular cultures are now going to have to coordinate to deliver a seamless, unified service. So what if we were to take the subject matter of things and artifacts, organizations focusing on things and artifacts to discover beauty. But if we shifted that to experiences, that's where the stuff is right now. Mm-hmm. And if we made experiences the subject matter, now you got to start thinking about time. And you can't have an experience without the unfolding of time. Yeah. And without the development of time. So not that space goes away, but it's not just these static things that, it's almost, there's a positive aspect to having static structures in the work world because they help reinforce certain values, certain ideals, but it can also make it incredibly hard to change.
Yeah.
So, instead of focusing on the idea of timelessness, what if we were to focus on the temporality of human experience? So we're familiar with works like the experience economy, thanks to Pine and Gilmore, where interestingly they talk about work as theater, and they look to Aristotle's Poetics and talk about the structure of plot. And this idea of an experience developing, you're starting with something that, there's a form to experience where it develops, culminates, and I think the technical theater word is denouement, unfolds and comes down. But can we have more of that type of thinking about when we're talking about beauty? Mm-hmm. Interestingly, Tim Brown, the CEO of IDEO, I think in his blog several years ago, and this is one of the things I think that interested me to the topic of beauty. He asked in one of his blog posts, what would we mean? What do we mean if we were to say that an organization is beautiful? And it's a little also, some people have made the distinction between aesthetics and beauty. Mm-hmm. I'm still trying to reconcile this difference because some will say aesthetics is really big, where it talks about beauty and ugliness, sadness, and all sorts of things within the human emotional spectrum. And beauty is one of those things. Some have called it specialized aesthetics. But then, as we started off today, if we were to blow that up and look beyond the 18th century, beauty is not just a technical term. It's fundamental to what it means to be human. Mm-hmm. And probably the paradox that I'm working with for my research is, in some ways, organizations are places where we come together, places where we unify to accomplish a common purpose, a lot of times through production. Mm-hmm. But how is it that these places where we come together to accomplish a common purpose fail in another sense, where we don't ever really, a lot of times, unify as a community? Mm-hmm. And so you can see the cultural dimension in this, where just because you come together and do stuff, even if you were to separate, you have the the division of work, and you coordinate that all together. It's a very instrumental view of organizations, right?
Sure.
And you produce something, like they say, there's that, I think, famous illustration of Boeing airplanes now, where every single part from the airplane is made from a different place in the world. But this organization is able to bring it all together and create this unified product. So from the standpoint of production, that makes sense, you know.
Right.
But is that all that an organization is?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a question, and oftentimes people have looked to the concept of beauty to find out what it means to unify something. The different notions of beauty inform this idea of unity
Mm-hmm.
And diversity. You know, you have things like I have my little bookshelf here. I think one of the books is The Future of Work.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of the concept of hyper specialization, where, you know, work is getting cut up into even more granular, tiny pieces. And
Mm-hmm.
you have things like the Amazon Turk and you know, Uber, where who's an employee nowadays? You don't have to necessarily be a formal employee within the boundaries of this thing that we call an organization.
Mm-hmm.
As we break work into even smaller parts, it's going to be even more challenging to integrate and unify all that. And I think we might think there's a tendency to think, well, as long as we can coordinate all of that, it's cheaper, so, you know, it's scalable. But what does that mean for the organization from the perspective of a place of community, a place of culture?
Sure.
And yeah, I think there's a lot to glean from this idea of beauty.
Yeah. I mean, it does sound like a really, like you said, rich area. I mean, it's so much, how deep it goes into culture, but then also the relationship between organizations and society in general. And
Right.
I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking of now is, as designers kind of intervening or creating change in these situations, you know, tackling something like that, trying to unify an organization, or at least, you know, wrapping your head around it, or making change in that situation. I mean, what kind of skills or what kind of approaches, I guess, could you even begin to take to work on that level? Yeah, are there people that have kind of gotten to that point, or is this still something that we need to develop those approaches?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know if I'm at the point where I can speak to some of the more particular details of that.
Sure.
But what I might be able to comment on is a lot of the work so far in the realm of aesthetic research and organizations has taken what I would call a grammatical approach, where here's the script, here's the code, someone has come up with it, and we want you to follow it. It's more so than genuine unity, it's more about uniformity. Here's how we want each one of our representatives on the front line we want them to speak a certain way. We want them to convey a certain tone or a certain feel. So it's more of a, here's the message, transfer the message, translate the message. And people, you know, they might follow the orders and they'll go along with it. Yeah, this is my part in the larger piece.
Mm-hmm.
But for there to be genuine unity, it's not just a passive, people aren't just passive recipients of information and communication and messages. I think they have to be willing to actively participate and say, I'm doing this not just because it's my job, where it's my designated role in the larger whole, but I'm actually really interested in how this will come out, just as much as, and I depend on that person over there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that calls for a different approach. So rather than what I would call a grammatical approach, where here's the message, here's how it should be interpreted, I'm interested in a rhetorical approach, as in, what are the arguments that need to be made to persuade other folks within the organization? It's not unity, I don't think, is something that you can accomplish by through SOPs and standard operating procedures and codes and rules, because people might comply with it, but they don't really actually buy into it. I don't like to use it. All right, scratch that word. I didn't say buy into it. Believe it.
Sure.
And in order for people to genuinely, I think, be a part of something, part of that unity, because just like you would be part of any community, you have to really believe it. And I think the mechanism to accomplishing that is through arguments. Mm-hmm. And so how does that change the role of designers and managers? If you are someone who is making arguments, and that means you have to think about other people within the organization as people with a certain amount of dignity and expertise. It's not just, here's a message, take it and run with it. Mm-hmm. But I want you to see there's a better way. Do you not see that this is the way to do things? Or what do you think? Sure. Because your ideas will inform my argument. Yeah. And I think it's a different, subtle approach to bringing unity and alignment. Mm-hmm. It's not just, here's a message, we all just need to be on the same page. No, it's what is that page that we want to write together? Yeah. And I think, if we think about the organization as a place of arguments, that might be a clue, one of the tools, to achieving or accomplishing beauty.
Yeah, I mean, we're basically out of time, but just one more reflection. I think that's a very interesting thing because while I'm not super familiar with rhetoric and kind of the way you would make a kind of convincing argument, but I imagine that you really need to also try and understand the other person's point of view. If you're really trying to persuade somebody, you do need to kind of ask them, and it needs to be some sort of reciprocal exchange where you're trying to figure out things a little bit together and understand their point of view a little bit more. And that seems, like a good process.
Yeah, well, this in some ways ties into your point about time. Because if you have the grammatical approach or the timeless approach, you take this message, we need to be on the same page. Here it is. Whether you're in a good mood, you're in a position to, or state of being or mind to accept that message, doesn't matter. Here it is. We've got to be on the same page. But when you're making an argument, there's also this thing called the right moment or opportunity. And this, I think, has also really interesting implications for service design. We talk about the right thing at the right time in the right way, right? When we talk about services, because at one moment in time, I might not be willing to listen to what you have to say. I'm just not interested, or it's not relevant to me. But there are some critical moments where people are going to be very interested in what you have to share. Mm-hmm. And I think this also introduces an interesting tool to the palette of the designer, sure, to the repertoire. It's not just about making, I think, anymore. It's also what the ancients called wisdom. Mm-hmm. Knowing when to speak versus when not to speak is in one sense a way of understanding and really knowing your audience. There's certain things where, even as we're talking within our 30 minutes, there's certain details I didn't have to share with you about my background because it's just not appropriate. It's not the right opportunity. And so that kind of gives you a strategy, I think, a prioritization of what to do, what to not do. It's not just about making as a designer, but what do you make and when? And when do you share that making? And I know I'm being very abstract right now, but I think those are some things that we get by considering time and timing. Yeah. It's not just any time, but there's a right time to do something. So I'll leave it at that.
It's a great note to end on.
It's a good time to end.
Yeah, I guess so. All right. Well, Kipum, thank you very, very much for spending some time chatting about this. I had a really great time listening to what you had to say, and I hope others did too. And if anybody has any questions or kind of wants to comment on our chat, feel free to reach out. Or if you want to join a future chat, you can always visit chats.desmanetwork.eu. And we hope to keep this conversation going and having interesting speakers like Kipum and have the movement continue. So we'll see how it goes.
Thank you, Andrew. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you, Kipum. All right. Take care, everyone.
Have a good one.